Ladies and gentlemen, the play is the thing. With your host, Judy Sleed. Special guest, Talia Carner, author of Jerusalem Maiden. Now here's Judy.
Thank you, Lee. That was lovely. I have a wonderful guest, a lady who is an author, Talia. So nice of you to come and visit us.
Thank you, Judy, for having me here.
And I read your book, and I've been telling everybody about it. It is a fascinating, wonderful book, and I hope you're going to tell us all about it.
Thank you.
And I detect a slight accent. Where are you from?
I was born in Israel. I'm an American novelist with an Israeli accent.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I don't know if you could detect my accent because I'm a Hungarian with an American. I'm an American with a Hungarian accent, yes. So you were born in Tel Aviv, that's what you said. And you've been, but you are Americanized. And you look so beautiful, you put together, you could be a fashion designer, maybe you are.
No, I'm not.
No, you're not.
I'm a full-time novelist.
Full-time, but that's
I work
rare.
very hard on my craft.
Yes, well, this book is all about women or Jewish people living in the 19th century. Well, come on, let's help me out a little bit.
Okay, Jerusalem Maiden is set in Jerusalem 100 years ago, the end of the Ottoman Empire rule of the Holy Land. The Ottoman Empire ruled the entire region. Actually, it spread over 4 continents for 400 years. So when the novel starts in 1911, it's the last 6 years of this 400-year stretch, because the Ottoman Empire ruled from 1517 to 1917. At any rate, the protagonist, Esther Kaminsky, is 12 years old when we first meet her. She is supposed to get married shortly and produce many sons in order to hasten the Messiah's arrival. But she discovers her extraordinary talent for art, which is against the second commandment. Thou shalt not make any graven image. And in Judaism, unlike Christianity, that is why art was never developed. The Western art, as we know it today, was developed under the auspices of the church. The church sponsored and patronized artists, needless to say, all men. But in this particular case, we have a young woman who knows that visual expression is against God's commandment.
Now you're talking about as a woman, but she's only 12 years old and already she's supposed to get married at 12?
That's what, at that time, in that society, they married the girls off very young because the entire community had a sense of mission, of saving the world Jewry. Just living in Jerusalem was a spiritual experience, so to supposedly, but the girls, the young women, married hopefully Talmudic scholars and supported them through lifelong studies of the Torah. And their studies was supposed to help hasten the Messiah's arrival and bring salvation to all Jews. So the entire responsibility of saving the world Jewry was on the shoulders of 12-year-old girls. And that is where...
Which was extraordinary.
It's extraordinary for us today. It's not totally unusual for any fundamentalist society, religious society, to put tremendous amount of burden on women in general, because even today when we look at societies, I mean, today we can look mostly at Muslim societies where purity begins and ends with a woman's body. The religion hinges on the separation of men and women, and women's obedience, and child brides are the common practice, because that's how you can continue to subjugate women. So it was not unusual in that situation in Jerusalem of 100 years ago. And interestingly, you mentioned you came from Hungary. Many people who came to Jerusalem at the time, and I'm talking late 1800s, early 1900s, they came from societies where women got married younger than they do today, but not as children. And immediately there was a change that was unusual, and sociologists never were able to fully explain why in Jerusalem of the time they married off girls as young as they did, but that's what they did as soon as girls reached maturity or puberty. And so my protagonist, Esther, discovers this extraordinary talent for art. She goes to school, which was also unusual because keeping women whom society wants to marry them off young, it's very important to keep them not only obedient and acquiescent, but also illiterate, which was the common situation for that community. But there was a school, Evelina de Rothschild, which was developed at that time, had only 300 girl students, but my protagonist is one of the lucky ones, and her father does believe in educating his daughter. She finds out later that he does that because he wants her to be a better mother to boys. That was his entire reasoning for sending her to school, but nevertheless, her French teacher discovers her art. The French teacher herself is an amateur artist, and we meet her over many years later in relations to that. And all I'm telling you now is not just chapter 1, but the first 2 pages of the book.
I know. When I was reading it, it was very difficult for me to remember that she's only 12 years old, because what she does, it's like a grown-up woman.
At the same time, some of the ways that she envisions God and her importance in God's eyes, it was very interesting for my research to crawl into the skin of a young woman who's been indoctrinated to that aspect. And also very interesting, in Jerusalem of the time, we are talking about old Jerusalem, under the Ottoman Empire, they had not brought any development that we already saw in the rest of the world. So there were no running water, no sanitation, no electricity. And it's hard for us today to fathom what does it mean to live with no electricity, because it also meant no news. It meant no information, no music. She never heard music in her life until later on when she meets her cousin who plays music. And so here you have a very insular society, the ultra-Orthodox, that further isolates the girls. And it's easy because you don't have news, you don't have information. Her father reads the newspaper, so she sometimes sneaks a look at that.
And I like the part that when you're written about her and her girlfriend, like the 2 young girls are conversing, there you could see that they are only 12 years old.
Yes. So the research was very interesting because these Jewish women in Jerusalem of the time, and most were very, very religious. Even the ones who were supposedly secular were pretty much entrenched in tradition. And I'm not talking, that was very different from the Zionist movement that had begun and was coming to the Holy Land with women who were coming from Europe. They were students already. They were more mature, and they were seeking equality with men and sometimes political voice. Guess what? Golda Meir was an example of the Zionist women, the same age as my protagonist. So now you can imagine the difference of the kind of women. We did not know, there is a lot of information about the Zionist women because they wrote letters back home, they kept journals, they wrote short stories, poetry, and so on. Not so the Orthodox women, who thought that suffering in Jerusalem was going to bring the Messiah. It was good to suffer, but suffering meant water that was filled with maggot, shortages, pestilence, plagues. Half their children died before the age of 5. Infant mortality, 50%. 50% maternal death, because these young women started giving birth very early, and by the time their third and fourth and fifth child, they were still teenagers, they would die. So that was, all of this suffering was supposed to bring the Messiah. So they didn't keep information, or either they were illiterate or there was no information. So I had to do a lot of oral interviews, oral histories of old women about their mothers' lives to get those nuances. And
well, you brought out the suffering very real. I mean, I felt it as I was reading it, especially with the cold. I never realized Jerusalem had snow. I mean, you would think the whole country is always, because I have friends in Israel, and they always say how hot it is.
You know, people don't realize how cold Jerusalem gets in winter. It is freezing, and especially, not only there's snow almost every year. It's smattering. It's little, maybe a couple of inches most of years, and it melts within a couple of days. But even my editor at the beginning was surprised. I sent her a link to a website to see what's the weather in Jerusalem.
I looked it up on the internet because I never thought Jerusalem.
Yeah, many people are surprised at that. What is important about it is how cold it got, or it gets, and when you're not fully equipped. I mean, if you you cannot heat up the homes. You didn't have trees to create coals or fire, open fire. The heating of houses was very difficult, was a big problem. And at that time, the Ottoman Empire also was fighting battles all over the world, in all of its borders. So they were cutting down the woods in order to feed their trains and their war machines, and they were stealing everything they could from the countries they controlled. So yes, it was very cold in Jerusalem. And what do you do when it's so cold? People just, if possible, they didn't leave the house. But that is also when the infant mortality reached new heights. It's not cold weather.
So it is, I visited Israel just once, and it's beautiful. And like you said, it's so much different than what it was 100 years ago. They did a tremendous job in Israel in just 100 years.
What year were you there?
Oh, about 4 years ago. Yeah, I was supposed to emigrate to Israel, but en route I changed my mind and I came here. So a lot of my friends are still there, so I went to visit them. So I really would like to see a few pictures as we talk about how it was then and today, because now they have all these modern buildings and paved roads and highways. Yeah. But it wasn't like that 100 years ago.
Israel is a very, very modern country.
Yes.
Very progressive, very advanced. The gross national product is huge, great growth. Actually, Israel did not go through the financial crisis, economic crisis that's been going on here for 3 years, because it continues to grow all the time in spite of all its problems. But that is a totally different subject. We need to stay within 100 years ago.
Yes. 100 years ago.
What I also found very interesting was the neighborhoods in Jerusalem, the Jewish neighborhoods. Once the old city was extremely crowded, and they started moving out, creating new neighborhoods. But they were afraid of the Turks would come in and steal children for lifelong service in the army for 25 years. A child of 9 would be kidnapped off the street, never to be returned to his family. So the way they built the neighborhoods, they would be made out of 1 to 2 room houses that are all attached with the backs to the thoroughfares, and in the center is where the community life took place. That's where the yeshiva would be, the water hole, the laundry shed, the outhouses, the oven, the bakery would be there because they couldn't bake in their own homes, and so on. So everything was in the center, and the neighborhoods would have actually gates that would close for the night. That original structure is still there in all of these but one neighborhood that was taken down, replaced, but all of those buildings are still there. I walked with a 1912 map of Jerusalem with each building I could locate the same thing. What happened as there was more crowding, they filled the center open public space with alleys and more houses and rows of houses. They built second floors on some houses, which was not easy because the original structure had domes, because they only knew how to build with this big stone the way the Arabs did. So the one-room house would have a big round dome. So you couldn't build the second floor very easily. So you had to build it in between two domes, between two houses. You would build another room that would serve for another family. So that was kind of tricky. But in that neighborhood, this is where those women were gathering. They rarely left. They had been indoctrinated for fear of others. Others would be anybody that was not their own community, even other Jews, let alone Arabs and Christian missionaries, which they were very active in that time. And beside the fear of others, they were also covered in heavy clothing, and by ignorance, and by suffering, and by not keeping any information and giving out any information. So I discovered this to be a very well-kept secret, and I needed to find out how a young woman in that society who is seeking freedom could find it without losing her faith. It's very easy to say, okay, give up on God and go off. No, you can't do that when God is crouching in one's head and is there reading her thoughts, seeing every vision that she sees, remembering her dreams after she wakes up and holding them against her.
Yes.
So how can this young woman find freedom? And that is the question that also comes up today when we look at religious societies, fundamentalist societies, where women don't have choices because they're indoctrinated. But also women who are not in religious societies. Do we all get as much freedom as we could claim? Or do we have psychological inhibitions that prohibit us from following our dreams or our talents or living our own lives to their fullest?
Well, that all depends where you come from and what beliefs you have, and then where you go, your environment. If you come in contact with other people who have more freedom, then you have a choice. But you said it all depends what is inside you, how you feel about it. So there is a conflict, and in your book, certainly there is a tremendous amount of conflict, how this young woman deals with her emotions and feelings and what is right and what is wrong and how she sees the world. I mean, you do a beautiful job explaining that.
Yeah, and I want to say something. This book was inspired by my own grandmother's untapped artistic genius. I always thought, when I was 16 actually, I was in Paris for the first time.
I was going to talk about that.
Yeah, and I went to a French high school in Tel Aviv, and I was sent by my school for a month to France, and I was walking in Montmartre, which is, everybody knows where Sacré-Cœur is, and all the artists, the street artists, and I suddenly understood with this unshaken knowledge that my grandmother should never have been my grandmother. She should never have gotten married. She should never have had children. Instead, she should have been an artist during the avant-garde era and have achieved international acclaim as an artist. So Jerusalem Maiden, which we see the picture of the cover here.
Yes.
And you have a book here, I see. It's a what-if story of what if my grandmother had bolted and tried to fly instead of having her wings clipped. And I had the book my mother read, and her two sisters, all three still alive. She has one more sister, but who didn't read the book. But three sisters read the book, and they all said that I nailed the character of their mother perfectly without any single event being in her life. It's all fictionalized. It's not her life. It's not that the home is not the home she grew up in, because my family was very well established in Jerusalem and did not live in a kind of squalor, which was the most common situation. They were pretty well to do. But even my mother said to me, how did you know that my grandfather had a roll-top desk for his financial business? You know, I had so many details that I got out of that, and especially the character of a woman who is unhappy because she eventually, when we see her later, when she gets married, a lot of women would have been very content with her life.
Yes.
But the struggle is internal. The struggle for fulfillment is totally internal.
Another thing I stood out when you talked about Paris, that the sun was out till 10 p.m.
Oh yeah, in the summer in Europe, you know how it is in Europe in the summer.
I don't remember.
Depends on the time zone, but it's
you describe Paris
maybe 9:30 or something in summer. It's
and I like the way you described that French lady who's teaching art. That's also very delightful, the way you deal with it.
She's an early feminist.
Yes.
She's an early feminist. And we get some little things from her. Mademoiselle Thibault, she is the mistress of a man who's obviously married, has another family. She has a son with this man. She's obviously a side character, but very important, because she is the one who gives a role model to Esther, whether of a different kind of a woman.
That's another curious thing with all her religious beliefs, Esther. She loves this woman.
Because she represented so much more. But at the same time, Mademoiselle Thibault respected Esther's life and religion and never tried, except for the one conversation when Esther comes to talk to her about what she should do. And she said, start thinking about what your God wants of you. And Esther is not ready. Esther is not ready to hear any of that yet. But what's interesting, Mademoiselle Thibault mentions, for example, when we meet her in Paris, that women, and this is 1924, she says, I own the apartment, whereas a married woman is not allowed to own property. So she sees herself as the lucky one, that she's not married and she can own her own property, and which gives us a glimpse. In 1924, Paris, France, women who were married could not own the property. And so that is how we start meeting her as an early feminist.
So is there anyone in your family who writes books or anything?
No, I'm the novelist, but my mother became the artist that my grandmother never became. And my mother is 87 years old. She still paints and exhibits and sells.
Here in the United States?
No, in Tel Aviv. And her name is Reviva Yoffe, Y-O-F-F-E. And she literally sold thousands of paintings in her life. In tiny little detailed, very, very detailed. She works them as fast as her mother worked the knitting and the crocheting and all of the other form of arts that were permitted to women at the time. So my mother became a very successful artist. She also exhibited internationally. Her sisters, myself, we all artistically inclined. We can produce stuff. I've sculpted in my life, but my form is writing.
Is right. What about your dad?
He was a talented man in many ways.
But not a writer.
No, nobody was a writer, but we all were storytellers. My grandmother was a storyteller.
So when did you decide to start writing?
And November 3rd, 1993 at 2:48 p.m.
Are you talking about this book or in
No,
general?
my writing career. Jerusalem Maiden is my fourth novel.
That's a very unusual answer. I didn't expect that. I like it though.
Jerusalem Maiden is my fourth novel. The first novel that I started in that time, I'm telling you, in 93, was not published. Then Puppet Child came, it was published. Then China Doll.
Yeah.
Puppet Child was published in 2002, and it set in Long Island, actually. It's about a mother fighting the court system to save her daughter from molestation by the father. And it's a legal drama that launched not just my public writing career, but activism. I launched a law called the Protective Parent Reform Act, which is now passed in 4 states and in front of the legislature and many others. And then China Doll, which is about an American pop singer and a concert tour in China when a baby is thrust into her arms.
So you're going to have to come back because this is fascinating. I'm just, no wonder, because I was fascinated with the books. I'm fascinated with you. You're a very unusual and very interesting person.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate you coming and to decorate my stage here. And half hour is at a close. I mean, I told you this is only a half-hour show, and but I think you covered everything. And well, I wish you a lot of luck. I guess you're working on another book.
Yes, I'm working on about a couple of books. Actually.
A couple.
Yes.
Well, that's.
But it's going to take a long time, so don't expect another book for another 5 years. So you might as well.
Well, it keeps your mind occupied. Because when I have a story to tell, like I said, I've been writing plays and other stuff, and that's always like, what is that word? My mind.
Percolates.
That's a good word. I was going to say so, but every time I'm doing something, all of a sudden I think of it, and it just happens. And then, of course, when I sit down to write it, it's all there already. That's how the mind works.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. It was. But we're done. They're just finishing up.